He didn't know it yet, but the moment he offered his jacket to a freezing stranger at a lonely New York bus stop, his entire life was about to shift. The wind sliced through the streets like icy knives, carrying snow that spun in soft spirals under the dim streetlights. The city's usual roar felt muffled, swallowed by winter's quiet weight. Under a flickering lamp, Henry stood alone, shoulders hunched against the cold in a threadbare olive jacket. A worn manila folder was clutched tight against his chest. Inside 5 resumes, each one stamped with silent rejection. He breathed out slowly, watching fog curl from his lips. 46 years old, once a construction engineer, a widower, a father, and now for the moment a man without a home. The thought landed heavy, like the snow building up at his boots. The red glow of a pharmacy sign blinked 8:41 p.m. The bus was late. Cold seeped through the cracks in his scuffed boots, biting at his toes. Then, through the curtain of falling snow, a figure appeared. A woman, early 30s maybe, dressed sharp, a pencil skirt, pale blouse, no coat. Her heels clicked on the icy pavement, too loud in the hush. Wet hair clung to her face as she hugged herself, trembling. She stopped beneath the same awning, breathing in quick, shaky bursts. Henry tried not to stare, but something about her presence demanded notice. She was polished yet fragile like glass about to shatter. She rubbed her bare hands together, trying in vain to warm them. He turned away, telling himself she was just another stranger on another cold night. But then the wind howled through the street and she flinched, curling inward. Henry looked back. His jacket wasn't much, but it was all he had. He could stay quiet, let her suffer, pretend it wasn't his concern, the way most people would. But that wasn't who he was. Without a word, he slipped the jacket off. The air bit into his skin. He stepped toward her, holding it out. Startled, she blinked. "You don't have to do that," she said, voice soft but tense. Henry offered a tired smile. "I've already lost enough today. This coat, it's the one thing left I can give." She hesitated, frowning. "But you need it more than I do." Still, he gently draped it across her shoulders. "Not tonight." The warmth surprised her. It smelled faintly of soap, maybe coffee, maybe something safer than the storm. Almost without meaning to, she pulled it closer. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry nodded, folding his arms tight against the cold. For a while they stood in quiet as snowflakes drifted down around them, soft as feathers. After a moment, she turned. "What's your name?" "Henry." "I'm Claire. Nice to meet you, Claire." Her eyes searched his face. "You really shouldn't have given me your jacket," he shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Probably not, but I couldn't just watch you freeze." A low rumble broke the silence. A bus emerged from the snowy blur, headlights cutting through the white. Claire stepped forward, then hesitated, glancing back at him. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked carefully. Henry lifted a shoulder. "Somewhere," he said, leaving unsaid that somewhere was the cracked back seat of a rusting truck behind a warehouse. She reached into her purse, pulled out a card, and pressed it into his hand. "If you ever need anything." He tucked it inside the folder without looking, telling himself he wouldn't use it. People said things like that. Most never meant them. Claire boarded the bus, wrapping his jacket around herself like a shield. She looked back once before the doors closed. Henry watched until the bus lights blurred and disappeared into the falling snow. Alone again, he stood shivering, not just from the cold, but from something quieter, steadier, stirring inside. He glanced at the sky, then at the empty street. "Maybe tomorrow," he murmured and turned away, footsteps crunching softly. Henry wandered through the sleeping back streets, snow squeaking beneath his worn shoes. There was no reason to rush, no one waiting, no warm window light calling him home, only the familiar shadow of his truck by the old warehouse. By the time he reached the dented '98 Chevy, the clock read just after 9. Rust streaked its sides, and the heater hadn't worked in years. Inside, a nest of blankets and a lopsided pillow filled the front seat. A lunchbox sat tucked beneath the dash. He climbed in, shut the door, and exhaled into the dark. From the glove box, Henry drew out a small tin. Inside lay a faded photo. Lily, his wife with her bright smile, and Noah, their boy at 7, grinning crookedly. "Good night, Lily," Henry whispered. "Good night, Noah." He leaned back, eyes on the sagging ceiling, letting memories wash over him. Once he'd been Henry Miles, structural engineer, builder of homes, schools, hospitals, a man with a wife who taught kindergarten and laughed with her whole heart. Even in the hardest seasons, Lily had laughed easily, a bright, unfiltered sound that filled every room. Their son had inherited that same laugh, wild and joyful. They hadn't been wealthy, but they'd been content, stitched together by love and small dreams. Then came the diagnosis. By the time doctors found the cancer, it was already stage 4. 9 months later, Lily was gone. Henry had walked away from work to care for her, and when she slipped from his hands, everything else unraveled too. Bills stacked up like walls, savings vanished, and piece by piece he sold their life away. First the house, then furniture, then the last fragile bits of security, until all that remained was an old truck and his boy. Still, Henry tried to protect Noah from the edges of loss. He turned the back seat into a spaceship bound for Jupiter, canned soup into treasure hunts, a parking lot into a secret backyard. Every morning, no matter how little sleep he'd had, he walked Noah to school, clean-shaven, shirt tucked in, as if appearances alone could keep hope alive. "Why bother cutting your hair?" a shelter worker had asked once, puzzled by his persistence. Henry's answer was simple, steady. "Because my son needs to believe things can get better, and I need to look like I believe that too." He worked any job he could find, hauling furniture, cleaning gutters, sweeping construction sites. It never added up to enough, but it kept them together. Until last fall, that was when a social worker came, clipboard in hand, voice calm but firm. She said Noah needed stability, safety. Henry didn't fight. Somewhere deep down, he knew she wasn't wrong. Through tears, he signed the papers, hugged his boy close and whispered, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been an uphill climb. He sent out resumes, stood in long job fair lines, scribbled notes at free workshops, studied building codes at the library. He was building something, not houses anymore, but a plan, brick by quiet brick. Tonight, though, sitting in the freezing truck, rubbing his arms to keep warm, that plan felt far away. His thoughts wandered to Claire, the stranger at the bus stop. The way she'd shivered, startled when he'd offered his coat. He didn't fully understand why he'd done it. Maybe she'd reminded him of Lily, or maybe he just needed to prove, to himself if no one else, that he was still capable of giving more than he took. Outside, snow still fell in steady sheets, coating the world in fragile white. Henry pulled a thin blanket over himself, leaned against the cold glass and closed his eyes. He didn't have much, but he still had himself. And for tonight, that would have to be enough. Across the city, Claire stepped into the glossy warmth of her apartment lobby. Heat wrapped around her instantly, chasing the sting from her skin. The doorman greeted her with a nod, but she barely noticed. Her heels clicked softly on polished marble as she moved toward the elevator, still wrapped tight in the jacket Henry had given her. She hadn't meant to take it. She'd tried to give it back, but the look in his eyes had silenced her protests. Steady, tired, yet somehow gentle. Now the jacket felt heavy, awkward against her business clothes, threadbare yet warmer than anything she'd worn in years. Inside her penthouse on the 28th floor, silence pressed in. No TV hum, no laughter, only the low whir of appliances and the muffled growl of winter winds against glass. Claire set her purse on the console and began to slip off the jacket when her fingers brushed something in the inner pocket. Curiosity tugged. She reached in and drew out a folded piece of paper, creased and worn from time. She unfolded it carefully. A child's crayon drawing smiled back at her. 2 stick figures beneath a crooked sun, hands joined. One was labeled Dad, the other Me. Between them floated a red heart. At the bottom, uneven letters read, "I love you, Daddy. Noah." Claire froze. The words blurred as her eyes filled. She lowered herself onto the couch, jacket still in one hand, the picture trembling in the other. Noah. The name clung to her thoughts like a burr. The way Henry had held his folder, the exhaustion behind his smile, It all aligned now. He wasn't just some man who'd handed over a coat. He was a father carrying a small piece of his child close, even through the cold. She looked around at the pristine apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows, designer furniture, flawless surfaces, a space crafted for success, not comfort. No photographs, no echoes of laughter. Claire set the drawing gently on her lap, then hugged the jacket against her chest. Its faint scent, soap, maybe coffee, maybe memory, pulled something loose inside her. Tears pricked her eyes, sudden and unfamiliar. She couldn't remember the last time she'd really cried. Not since she'd been a little girl, small and hungry, perched on the steps of a church, praying someone would notice her. That night someone had. A man with kind eyes and weathered hands had draped his coat over her shoulders. He hadn't said much, only smiled and whispered, "You'll be okay." That single moment had lit a path she didn't know she could follow. She never saw him again, but she'd carried that warmth ever since. Claire wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. She wasn't that girl anymore. She'd fought her way out of foster care, powered through college on grit and scholarships, and turned a single app idea into Infinity Group, one of the East Coast's most powerful tech companies. She had earned every dollar, every headline, every quiet nod of respect in glossy magazines. But somewhere along the climb, Claire had let herself forget what it felt like to truly need and what it felt like to give. Tonight, a stranger on a snowy street had reminded her. Her gaze fell once more on the crayon drawing, on the shaky red heart hovering between two stick figures. Then she looked at the coat bunched in her lap, frayed and too large, yet strangely heavy with meaning. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire Langston cried. Not because she was broken, but because something inside her had been gently, irrevocably cracked open. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the skyline beyond her floor-to-ceiling office windows. Claire sat at her sleek desk, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beside her laptop. But her eyes stayed fixed on the worn drawing in her hand, its edges now soft from being unfolded again and again, as though she could imprint each crayon stroke into memory. She had barely slept. All night, she had replayed the scene. Henry standing there in the snow, offering his only coat without a flicker of hesitation, sorrow tucked behind a quiet dignity. Something about him clung to her thoughts, not just his kindness, but the loneliness he seemed to carry like a shadow. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a polished silver bell. At its soft chime, Rachel, her assistant, appeared in the doorway. "Yes, Miss Langston." Claire's voice was steady but threaded with resolve. "I need you to help me find someone." Rachel blinked. "Of course, who?" Claire paused her heartbeat. "His name is Henry. I don't know his last name. He was at the bus stop on 56th and Madison last night around 8:30. He gave me his jacket. I want to find him." Rachel's brows lifted, but she nodded quickly. "I'll see what I can do. And, Rachel," Claire added, her tone lowering, "this stays between us. Over the next few days." Claire's instructions were carried out with the same quiet precision usually reserved for high-stakes acquisitions. Her team, accustomed to tracking elusive developers or luring star executives, now turned their skills toward the life of a man who existed mostly in the margins. They combed traffic cam footage from nearby intersections, a blurred figure in an olive jacket, shoulders hunched against the wind. They pulled transit data, traced every bus route that stopped near Madison that night, cross-referenced riders against corporate databases. Nothing fit. Then Rachel returned, clutching a slim folder. "His name is Henry Miles," she said gently. "Used to be a structural engineer. No current job records. I found a few forum posts. He'd been asking about work. The contact number's tied to a prepaid phone. No fixed address." Claire flipped through the pages. An old driver's license photo, a LinkedIn profile frozen in time, a faded scan of a construction license. No arrests, no scandals, just an absence, a quiet slide out of sight. She closed the folder, the silence around her suddenly weighty. "Where is he now?" she asked. Rachel hesitated. "One of our guys spotted him near the south end of the Bronx. There's an old pickup parked behind a warehouse. He's been sleeping in it." Claire stood, the decision instant. "I want to go there." Rachel frowned. "Are you sure?" We could send someone, invite him here. No. Claire's voice cut gently but firm. This isn't business. It's personal. Rachel studied her, then nodded. I'll arrange a car. An hour later, Claire sat in the back seat of a black sedan, winding through streets far removed from glass towers and polished boardrooms. They passed shuttered shops, walls dressed in graffiti, people huddled against the biting air. The driver slowed near an aging warehouse. Snow was piled against a battered Chevy tucked deep in the shadows. It looked as if it hadn't moved in days. Claire stepped out, heels crunching softly over gravel. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp stone. She approached the truck carefully. Through the windshield, she saw a figure slumped in the front seat. As she neared, the door creaked, and Henry stepped out, blinking at the sudden daylight. For a moment his face was blank, then confusion sharpened into recognition. His gaze darted from her to the car behind her, to his own wrinkled clothes and snow-dusted boots. Embarrassment flickered there, quick as a shadow. "Claire," he said, his voice rough from sleep and cold. She offered a tentative smile. "Hi, Henry." He glanced at himself again, the truck, the rumpled layers, the reality of where she'd found him. What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," she replied simply. He frowned, folding his arms across his chest. "Why?" Claire hesitated, her breath fogging in the sharp air. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. About the kind of man who gives his only coat to someone he doesn't even know." Henry let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. "You didn't have to hunt me down for that. A thank you card would have done fine." "It's not about thanks," she said, eyes steady. "It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen." For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Two people from worlds so far apart, standing on a patch of frozen gravel, bound by a single act in a bitter wind. Henry finally released a long breath. "You came all this way just for that?" Claire nodded slowly. "Yes, and maybe something more." The next time Claire found him, Henry was bent over a stack of cinder blocks on a half-finished site in Queens. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, watching from a distance. He worked with a steady rhythm, hauling, stacking, lifting, quiet, efficient, a man used to being overlooked. His sleeves were rolled despite the biting air, breath fogging in soft clouds. Dust clung to his flannel shirt, to the calluses on his hands, but every movement carried purpose. When the foreman called a break, Henry sat on a low wall, sipping from a battered plastic bottle. Claire stepped out, her heels crunching against grit. Henry glanced up, then blinked, startled. He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "Claire?" "Hi again," she said, offering a small, genuine smile. "What are you doing here?" She held out a paper cup. "Thought you might like something warm." He hesitated, then accepted the coffee, eyes narrowing in quiet curiosity. "You really didn't have to." "I know," she replied gently. "I wanted to." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled with hammering in the distance and the smell of wet concrete. Then she spoke again. "Would you come with me? Just for a little while. There's something I'd like to show you." Henry glanced at his boots, then toward the foreman across the yard. "I've got a few hours left on shift." "I already cleared it," Claire said lightly. "Told him you had an interview." His brows lifted. "I don't have an interview." "You do now." A surprised laugh escaped him, brief and awkward. "All right, let's see where this goes." They drove in silence. Henry fidgeted, glancing at his dust-covered jeans, the grit under his fingernails, the faint trace of sweat on his collar. Claire, calm behind the wheel, didn't seem to notice. When they arrived at Infinity Group's downtown headquarters, Henry paused just inside the sweeping lobby. He stared at the glass walls and marble floors, at the tide of suits streaming past. "I don't belong here," he muttered. "Come upstairs," Claire said quietly. She led him to a private conference room lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight spilled across a polished table. Henry settled uneasily into a chair as Claire closed the door and took a seat opposite him. He cleared his throat. "So, what's all this about? Returning the coat?" Claire shook her head. "No, the coat's mine now," Henry blinked. "Okay." She leaned forward, her voice softer than before. "I didn't come to thank you. I came because you made me remember something I'd buried, a version of myself I'd lost in years of boardrooms and deadlines. You reminded me that change doesn't always start with strategy or innovation. Sometimes it begins with kindness. Henry lowered his gaze, discomfort flickering across his face. Claire, I'm just a guy trying to make it through the day. And that, she said firmly, is exactly why you're here. She slid a folder across the table. Inside lay a contract, a fresh proposal titled Cultural and Human Values Advisor. Henry frowned, flipping through the pages. What is this? It's a role I created, Claire explained. Someone to sit in on training, decisions, development. Not to talk numbers, but people, values, compassion. You'd share your experience, help shape the heart of this company. Henry gave an incredulous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Claire, look at me. I don't have a psychology degree. I didn't graduate from Harvard. I sleep in a truck. You were an engineer, she reminded gently. I haven't built anything in years. Yes, you have, Claire said softly. You built a moment I'll never forget. Henry looked away, overwhelmed. This isn't charity, Claire continued, steady and clear. This is a role only you can fill. You know how it feels to be invisible, to be passed over. And still, you stopped in the cold and gave your only coat to a stranger. That tells me more about leadership than any resume ever could. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, words tangled. I'm not qualified, he murmured at last. Claire leaned closer, her eyes unwavering. You don't need a degree to teach people how to care. You live it every day, she held his gaze. You don't need credentials to teach people how to be kind. You've lived it, and that's more powerful than anything you'll ever write on paper. Henry's throat tightened. He looked down at the proposal, then back at her, and for the first time in years, something stirred inside him. Not fear, not defeat, hope. Raw, unfamiliar, terrifying hope. Henry sat alone on the bench outside the gleaming office tower, the job proposal lying unopened across his knees. He traced the edges of the folder, but his gaze was fixed somewhere past the rush of traffic, far away. He couldn't do it, not because he didn't want to. Somewhere, buried deep, he did, but because fear clung to him, old and merciless, whispering in the voice he'd learned too well. She's just being kind. This isn't real. You'll ruin it, the way you always do. The offer felt like a gift wrapped around a trap, and Henry, who had survived by doubting anything that looked too good, couldn't push past the weight of suspicion. He didn't notice Claire until she sat quietly beside him. You haven't opened it, she said softly. Henry let out a dry, humorless laugh. Didn't think I needed to. I already know how this ends. Claire tilted her head. How? Someone like me doesn't end up here, he murmured, staring at the glass doors. You don't build a company like Infinity by hiring guys who sleep in trucks. You think I made you an offer out of pity? I think I don't belong in your world. Claire looked ahead, calm but thoughtful. Then she stood, holding out her hand. Come with me, just for an hour. No suits, no meetings, just trust me. Against his own instincts, Henry rose and followed. They drove for more than 30 minutes, away from the glittering skyline into quieter streets lined with tired storefronts. Finally, Claire pulled up before a red brick building with a faded green awning. A painted sign above the door read, Thomas's Place, a safe space for every child. Henry followed her inside. The hallway was bright, walls covered in painted animals and children's handprints. The air smelled of crayons and warm bread. Laughter echoed somewhere down the hall. High, unguarded laughter. Claire led him through a cozy kitchen, past a reading nook, and into a big playroom alive with second-hand toys and handmade posters. Children sprawled across the floor, building towers, reading stories, chasing each other in tiny bursts of joy. This place, Claire said quietly, was named after the man who saved me. Henry turned, startled. I grew up in foster care, she continued, her voice low but steady. Some homes were kind, some weren't. One night I ran away. I was 12. I curled up outside a church waiting for daylight. She paused, eyes fixed on the kids. He found me, an old man named Thomas. He gave me his coat and sat there all night. Didn't ask questions, just stayed. Henry said nothing. His throat felt thick. I never saw him again. Claire whispered, But that moment, it was like someone reached into the dark and said, "You matter. I built this place because of him." She looked at Henry then. "And last week someone else gave me a coat. Didn't know who I was, didn't want anything, just gave." Henry swallowed hard. "You remind me of him," she said softly. "Not because of what you handed me, but because of who you are." They stood surrounded by life and laughter. Henry's eyes drifted over the room. A volunteer kneeling to tie a shoelace, a boy reading with too much energy, a girl carefully coloring in a picture of the sun. It felt warm, real. Claire touched his arm. "I don't need you to fit in a boardroom, Henry. I need you to remind people of this, of what it means to care." Henry didn't speak. His eyes blurred, and though he tried to blink it away, tears slipped free. Quiet, unguarded. And then he nodded, not for the job title or paycheck, but because for the first time in years, he felt it. He was still needed, still useful, still human. Henry stood in the middle of a room alive with laughter, a single tear tracing the worn lines of his face, not sadness, but the profound relief of knowing he still mattered. His first day at Infinity Group passed without fanfare. No welcome banner, no cameras, just a small meeting in a glass-walled room on the 5th floor. A few skeptical department heads and a stack of sticky notes. Claire introduced him simply. "This is Henry Miles. He's here to help us build something more meaningful than profit." The looks that followed were polite, uncertain. Henry didn't flinch. He began to speak, not with a polished speech or practiced story, but with pieces. Honest pieces. How it felt to lose everything, to wake up freezing in a truck, to walk into interviews knowing your shoes had holes, to choose kindness anyway. At first they listened with quiet curiosity. By the end of that week they were leaning forward. Henry didn't preach. He didn't perform. He asked questions that made people pause. "When was the last time you really looked someone in the eye? Do you know the name of the janitor who cleans this floor? Floors? What would you do if you saw someone crying alone in the break room?" Henry didn't arrive with charts or complicated graphs. He arrived with empathy. And slowly, something inside Infinity Group began to change. One by one, employees started seeking him out. First the interns, then the junior developers, then even department heads. Some came to talk about pressure and sleepless nights. Others came just to sit near him during lunch, quiet but comforted. Henry listened, always patient. When he finally spoke, he didn't hand out quick fixes. He offered perspective. "You're not broken," he told a young programmer who admitted he hadn't slept in 3 days. "You're just tired. Being tired doesn't make you weak. It means you've cared for too long without someone caring back." That single line traveled everywhere, taped to cubicle walls, printed on mugs, written in company newsletters. From her corner office, Claire watched the ripple spread. The chatter in the break room softened, then warmed. Laughter returned lighter this time. Productivity rose, not from pressure but from people finally feeling seen. Before long, Henry had a small space of his own, cozy, filled with potted plants, second-hand books, and a coffee pot that never stayed full for long. Outside of work, life slowly rebuilt itself in quiet, steady ways. With Claire's help and a modest housing stipend from the company, Henry put a down payment on a tiny one-bedroom house at the edge of Brooklyn. It wasn't much, but it had a porch, a patch of soil waiting for a garden, and walls that didn't shiver when the wind howled. More importantly, it had space for Noah. Now in his first year at a local university, Noah moved back home. Their first dinner there was simple, spaghetti and garlic bread. But Henry would remember it for the rest of his life. "You kept your promise," Noah whispered, eyes shining. Henry couldn't answer with words, but the look he gave his son said everything. And Claire, she and Henry saw each other nearly every day. At first it was all business, meetings, planning, problem-solving. Then lunches stretched longer. Walks to the subway turned into weekend coffees, then quiet evenings watching old movies, talking about everything and nothing. There was no grand declaration, no rush, just two people once wrapped tight in their own armor, finding ease in the quiet company of someone who asked for nothing except to be present. One golden afternoon, standing on the rooftop as the skyline burned orange, Claire smiled. "You've changed this place, Henry," he chuckled softly. "No, I just reminded them of what they already knew." Her eyes lingered on him. "And you reminded me too." Not long after, Henry finished leading a workshop on resilience when a young man hesitated at the door. He couldn't have been more than 22, pale dark rings under his eyes. I needed to say this," the young man stammered. "Last month I was ready to quit. Everything. Life, I mean. I didn't think I could keep going. Then I heard you speak and it stopped me." Henry felt his pulse quicken. "You said people don't need to be fixed, they just need to be heard," the young man continued. "No one ever said that to me before. It felt like someone finally saw me. If it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here." Henry's chest tightened. He placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. "I'm really glad you are." When the room emptied, Henry stayed behind, sinking into a chair as the words replayed in his head. Once he'd wondered if he would ever matter again. Now he had his answer. That evening, the atrium of Infinity Group looked nothing like its usual self. Gone were banners shouting quarterly goals or product launches. In their place, soft white drapes, strings of warm lights, and a bold sign that read, in graceful lettering, "One Kindness Day." Employees filled the space, standing shoulder to shoulder, dressed not for business, but for something far deeper. Claire stepped up to the podium, eyes sweeping across the gathered faces. "This day isn't about metrics," she began, her voice clear and warm. "It's about moments." The room hushed. "A year ago, I stood at a bus stop in the freezing cold, tired, lonely, and more lost than I knew. Then a man I'd never met did something no one else had that night. He gave me his coat." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Claire smiled softly. It was old, frayed, but it meant everything, because it reminded me that kindness doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It shows up when the world least expects it. She turned to the easel beside her and lifted the cloth. Behind the glass sat that very coat, its fabric worn thin but glowing beneath the lights. A symbol of how one small act had changed everything. The sleeves, faded from years of use, yet displayed as if they were priceless. Beneath the frame, a bronze plaque gleamed, "One small act of kindness can rewrite a life." Claire's voice trembled just slightly. "That single act didn't just save me from the cold that night. It changed the entire direction of my life. And today, we honor not only that moment, but the man whose heart made it possible." She turned toward the edge of the stage. "Henry, would you join me?" Henry rose slowly, applause washing over him like a wave. He wore a plain suit, borrowed from a friend, pressed with care. But on his face was something new. Peace, and the quiet pride of someone finally standing where he belonged. He stepped beside Claire, who reached into her pocket and drew out a slim envelope. "This is for you," she said. Henry opened it with careful hands. Inside lay a stamped deed, the title to his new home. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Claire smiled, eyes bright. "No more nights in that truck." The room erupted, but Henry raised a hand. I have something too." From his jacket he pulled a small scuffed box, the kind that had clearly traveled a long road. His heart thundered as he met Claire's gaze. "You said this coat changed your life," he began, voice rough. "But you changed mine. You gave me back my name, my son, a roof, hope." He opened the box. Inside lay a modest silver ring, simple but catching the light as if it carried its own story. "I kept it in the pocket," Henry said, his words trembling. "Because if anything is more valuable than this coat, it's you." Claire's breath caught. Tears spilled, unashamed, as Henry asked, "Claire Langston, will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then Claire laughed, a soft, broken, beautiful sound, and nodded through tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." Cheers thundered, echoing off the glass ceiling as the two embraced. A month later, their wedding unfolded not in a ballroom but at Thomas's place, the small red brick refuge that meant everything to them. Children covered tables with paper flowers. Chairs were mismatched. The cake came from a young intern Henry once mentored, yet the room glowed with something no amount of money could buy. Claire wore a simple white dress, hair loose. Henry, again in that well-loved suit, stood tall, Noah proudly at his side as best man. Volunteers, colleagues, people from shelters, and dozens of employees whose lives Henry had touched filled the room. When it was time for vows, Claire held Henry's hands, eyes steady. "Once you gave me a coat," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "Tonight I give you my whole life." Her words fell over the room like sunlight through stained glass, warm, radiant, unforgettable. Henry couldn't speak. Tears rolled freely as the crowd wiped their own. Music swelled, laughter spilled into the courtyard. Children ran barefoot under strings of fairy lights dancing in the evening breeze. Someone snapped a photo. Henry and Claire beneath the Thomas's Place sign, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her. Beside them stood the old coat, weathered but now eternal. That photo would soon circle the world, shared and reshared, a quiet emblem of second chances, proof that a single, unassuming gesture can reach through the cold and rewrite a future. Sometimes the smallest thing, a coat, a smile, a kind word, echoes farther than we can imagine. Henry once had little to give, but he gave what he could, and in return he gained love, purpose, and a brand new beginning. Their journey reminds us, kindness doesn't ask for perfection. It only asks for presence, for heart. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that hope still waits in unexpected places, please like, share, and subscribe to HOA-GLORIOUS Stories. Here, we tell tales that warm the heart, restore faith in humanity, and remind us of what truly matters. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing.